Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And I start with a quote. I cannot blame anyone who, faced with so many political ills, despairs of the salvation of the human race and its progress toward the better. It's Kant. Conclusion of the Contest of the Faculties, second part. I'm an historian of contemporary history, engaged in research on the 20th century affairs and conflicts. So I'm not here as an historian of Enlightenment, but as an historian of my own discipline and its makings in the late 18th century. We must not forget that this modern scholarship of history has been really one of the outcomes of the Age of Enlightenment. There's a long list of authors who used its imperatives to engage in a critical view of the history. Think of Gibbon, Hume, Voltaire, or the collective piece of critical historiography of colonialism and slavery published under his own name by Raynal. We heard of him. Kant read a lot of historical writing of his time, and his reflection on history may be seen as part of this general movement in political thinking and social thinking that ends up what Rainer Koselleck has called really a revolutionary redefinition of history as a transformative move of mankind and our whole planet towards an open and unknown future. From an historian's point of view, Kant's philosophy, in particular his reflections on history, stands on the threshold of this new way of thinking about universalism and historicity. Today, historians may profit from reflecting on the legacy of Kant's critical philosophy when they engage in defending their professional approach to history against attacks from the political field, but also from inside academia in favor of, I would call it, less sophisticated and less empirical approaches towards the past. Kant's view on history was that of, you have heard it, a realist whose severe judgment on the rare inclination of men and women towards morality and civility induced him to keep any naive optimism at bay when reasoning about the past. The citation I have mentioned at the very beginning is one among other critical remarks about events and human deeds of the past we professional historians have to deal with. There's no simple weak history of progress and modernity to be found in Kant's writing, and his arguments in favor of a critical and rational reconstruction of the possibilities of mankind towards a better future sound rather up to date. I'll come to that at a moment. His reflection on the possibilities of a history in a weltbürgerlichen Absicht, a cosmopolitan perspective, is of relevance today and in a moment when the modern science of history, to use the German term Geschichtswissenschaft, returns towards to what now is called global history, and we had a marvelous example of that, and that is replacing the older world history modern scholarship for long had disdained as mere speculation. It is of high relevance, both professionally and political, how such a global perspective is founded in epistemic reason and professional methods. But such a reasoning with Kant must be aware of the obstacles history itself has erected and that have filled the chronological distance with intellectual reservations. One very obvious obstacle is Kant's critical philosophy itself. His epistemology did not deal with problems of modern historical scholarship for a very simple historical reason. At the time, historiography would not yet pretend to the status of Wissenschaft, science, or in German Wissenschaft. He read historiographical books of philosophers who would link pragmatic descriptions of past deeds and events with general speculations about the course of history, its laws and regularities. At best, Kant was a witness of the first steps of transformation that made historical scholarship a leading discipline of the Faculty of Philosophy in the 19th century. This making of modern historical scholarship accompanied the intellectual transformation of political and social thinking that made history that powerful and encompassing dynamism towards modernity in Western thought. The logics of historization of nature and mankind have distanced professional historians from Kant's world. As a result, a number of thinkers of this transformation, from Hegel, Ranke, and Droysen to Burckhardt, later Wiltey or Windelband, have become central to the epistemics of modern historiography. I have cited here expressively only names of German-speaking authors, as they have created a strong tradition of historical thinking that has placed itself in critical succession of Kant's epistemology under the headings of idealism in opposition to materialism or positivism. Therefore, we are heirs of a rather complicated history of reasoning with Kant and of taking up Kantianism in historical scholarship. I mention this European particularity as it stands in opposition to the way the epistemic reflection of historical scholarship developed in large parts of the Anglosphere. There, many professional historians thought of themselves as successors of an empiricist tradition stemming directly from Bacon or Hume. Both epistemic traditions, empiricist realism and post-Kantian constructivism, converged in founding a strong line of reasoning in favor of the idea of progress. This kind of progressive historicism was shared, for example, also by socialists and particularly by Marx and his followers. The second obstacle one must be aware of when returning to Kant today are the ways he was used in the internal debates. In the intellectual confrontation of materialists and idealists in the last decades of the 19th century, neo-Kantian epistemologies of Windelband, we heard of him and you remember the citation, and Rickert were taken up by professional historians in defense of their routines and their well-established academic discipline against the so-called threats of positivism and materialism and new forms of social and economic historiography. Ideographic approach and value orientation were the two buzzwords in this debate. Therefore, it was in defense of established professional routines and in the name of orthodox, nation-state-centered historiography that neo-Kantianism was used in epistemological debates among historians. There's an international echo to this debate, and neo-Kantianism found entrance in the epistemological debates in France or Britain, but was overshadowed there by empiricism, positivism, or in the case of the USA, by pragmatism. It is remarkable that Kant's critique did not play a prominent role in history when it came to a renewal of methods and themes during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Reasoning with Kant came back to history only via the new social sciences, where contemporary founding thinkers like Durkheim or Weber did borrow from Kant or neo-Kantian arguments to lay the theoretical and methodological ground of the new discipline they had in mind. Till the 1980s, Kantian epistemology did not play a prominent role in internal debates among professional historians. After the defeat of Nazism and fascism in 1945, historical scholarship on both sides of the Cold War returned to rather crude forms of objectivism or empiricism to legitimize their scholarly practice and to distance themselves of any form of cultural relativism linked to intellectuals who were fellow travelers of fascism like Heidegger or Schmidt. My task is not to not to comment in detail on the traditions of these reflections and the legitimation of my discipline since the early 20th century. but it may help to better understand the intellectual situation we are living in now. Reasoning with Kant seems useful to me from this situation today with regard to three aspects. First, to underpin the self-positioning of historical scholarship in the academic field. Second, to set critical limits to a constructivist epistemology of our discipline. And third, to reflect on the intellectual issue of a global perspective for historiography today. To the first point. In this specific situation, a return to Kant seems helpful as an invitation to take up the critical move of his epistemology and to reflect on the conditions of scholarship, truth claims, and the construction of evidence, all what makes up Wissenschaftlichkeit in German. Today we need sound arguments and clarity and about, to cite Bourdieu, the structure and function of the fields in which discourse on humanity is produced. Quote end. Such a reasoning with Kant does not engage in a strictly philosophical debate about his transcendentalism, but it transfers his critique to the ways scientific knowledge can be produced both logically and socially. And it starts from what has been called the demolition, as Zamito had called it, of any unified theory of science, and the turn to pragmatic, moderate historicist accounts of the constitution of empirical inquiry, of all sorts, in the natural and the human sciences. This marks a distance from Kant's search for transcendental foundations of science, but it takes up his epistemological reflection on the condition of the way science or academic scholarship develops their own reasoning. So, under these very different presuppositions, for me it makes sense here to once again cite Bourdieu, expand and radicalize the critical intention of Kantian rationalism and give sociological and, I would add, historical weapons to the free and generalized exercise of an epistemological critique of all by all. So it's a kind of regulative idea that cannot but be universalist, that motivates this going back to Kant. And I take up Bourdieu's term of historicist rationalism or rationalist historicism, you can do it both ways, to characterize this position. But what does that mean practically? On the one hand, such a perspective insists on the element of rational control of all procedures necessary to produce professional knowledge of the past. The Kantian criticism can be interpreted as a self-reflexive control of source criticism, of constraints on interpretation, the critical evaluation of theories used to build source-based narratives of the past, and in the end, the rules of conduct regulating the falsification of historical information. We cannot but imagine the past as the thing in itself, Ding an sich, beyond all our reconstructive operations we are doing. What are the sociological or historical weapons Bourdieu speaks of when he insists to extend Kantian criticism? These weapons are the critical analysis of the whole range of internal and external rules regulating the production of scholarly knowledge in our discipline. The critical move of Kant to reflect and then define both the limits and the possibilities of rational scholarship and reasoning must be taken up to study empirically the practical conditions of regimes of rationality set up in a form of rational constraints. Think of the routines of research, namely the so-called historical critical check of oral or written sources, quantitative data, or material traces of the past. These traces form the elements from which to construct evidence necessary to transform any theoretical plausible discourse or narrative on the past into a old-fashioned expression, fact-based report or discourse. In our digital age, the standards of archival custody of these traces are of foremost importance, and they are threatened from many sides. The veto right of the sources, as Koselleck called this epistemic precondition of any rational construction of the past, has to be protected and must be used actively by professional standards and institutional settings. The spirit of Kantian critique has to be used when we look at the realities of peer reviewing and evaluation procedures for books, articles, but more so of positions in academia. All these practicalities are relevant as a second field where self-reflective reasoning is needed to keep up rationalism. The third area concerns the autonomy of professional research and teaching from public interventionism. Kant's intervention in the context of faculties is still relevant as a reminder to defend academic freedom as the right to controversial ideas and for constructive disagreement. There's large room for discussion by whom these elementary conditions for the functioning of historical scholarship are menaced today. Economic incentives, privatization of higher learning, and political interventionism have created a mix of combined risks to the autonomy, even in democracy, not to speak of the authoritarian regimes worldwide. Professionals' rules of conduct must prepare all scholars to be protected against infringements of autonomy and freedom. The last weapon such a Kantian rationalism has at hand to secure the rule of academic criticism is to reflect and practically work on what is called scholarly personae. This term defines a kind of regulatory idea that characterizes the personal traits of a professional historian and serves as a moral or professional yardstick to check the conduct of all scholars engaged in the professional field. It's not habitus, but it's a moral idea of that habitus, something like a better habitus. Its critical function is to control and limit the illegitimate effects of all kinds of power present in the social field of historical knowledge production. These scholarly personae change over time. They do not exist outside history and society. So we need a constant debate about the intellectual and moral qualities that help us to approach the professional idea and about the social rules and practical regulations that must be enforced on all scholars in order to keep up the conditions of professional knowledge. Reasoning with Kant in the field of historical science means to take internal control and self-reflection seriously as a kind of, and here the word is clear, professional duty. Let me turn to my second aspect, to set critical limits to a constructivist epistemology of our discipline. The defense of truth claims and of professional standards has become more urgent as we are confronted with the spread of reductionist versions of Foucault's or Derrida's philosophical self-criticism and their relativist skepticism. Their insights in the power-knowledge nexus have been transformed into a kind of axiomatic assumption that stops short of any kind of reflection about the specificities of this nexus and the ways its effects may be controlled, neutralized, or limited. This challenge is not new at all. Postmodernist theory from Ankersmit to White and Chakrabarty had defended this position since long. It stands in a well-known line of philosophical and political anti-historicism. Nietzsche's attack on liberal and socialist belief in progress by modern science and civilization has been the reservoir of ideas of this line of reasoning. Conservative skepticism about history, beside the selective cult of tradition, had found new attractive philosophical foundation in this self-critical move of the Enlightenment. Cultural relativism and political decisionism were the two most influential currents emanating from the Nietzschean move. These two radical positions gained visibility and prominence thanks to political and philosophical thinkers like Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger, mentioned earlier. I insist on this long tradition because of the long-term effects it has for epistemological debates in historical science today. For most postmodern constructivists and recent adherents, history is defined as a discourse among and in competition with other discourses on the past, and as such, it gains strength in the opposition towards any kind of objectivist pretensions in the name of scientific knowledge. And in their view, professional historians must mobilize resources of morality and political engagement to be heard in society. In order to serve this moral political mission, historiography must strengthen its imaginative and literary qualities. The scholarly procedures of truth-finding and critical checking of the traces of the past is more or less unreflected and taken into consideration as part of the rationality of knowledge production or discourse of the past. But radical constructivism avoided and still avoids, as I see it, any critical dialogue with a moderate constructivism or realism, as it is called nowadays, that had developed simultaneously and that insists on the links of the historical disciplines of all sorts to all other sciences and to develop our scholarship in a constant dialogue with all other empirical sciences. To be clear, critical historiography in a Kantian sense has no perspective without academic institutions and the autonomy of scholarship. I come to my third point, reasoning with Kant when reflecting on the intellectual issue of a global perspective for historiography today. Today, global history is considered the gold standard, and it's for good reason, as we heard. Its methods and theories are still rather shaky, and traditional historians with less ambition do insist on these shortcomings. But if we look at the ecological and political situation of our planet, I do not see any good reason to avoid a critical historiography that takes up the challenges of a globalized world. And we had a marvelous example of that. Here, Kant's reflection on history and historiography may be useful. Kant, as we heard it at the entrance, distanced himself from any simple optimistic version of history as moral and legal progress. His realism protected him from speculating about history as the fulfillment of reason. More than 200 years later, this realism fits much better the insights of historical scholarship than the master narratives of history as progress based on Hegel or Marx that have become Western doxa during the long 20th century, shared and popularized by liberalism and socialism. I'm following Axel Honneth's interpretation of Kant's philosophy of history when he insists on the fact that Kant was not completely convinced by his own arguments in favor of progress as developed in his earlier writings up to the 1980s. He had developed both a cognitivist and a moral argument, to use the qualifications used by Honneth, in favor of a historiography or philosophical interpretation of the past that reconstructs the long march of mankind towards better morality, the making of a civil society and the rule of law both inside and between states. The cognitivist argument makes nature itself the force that realizes this progressive line through the fundamental antagonism in society, as it was called, or the unsocial sociability of mankind, placing the individual in strife with society. Kant took up Rousseau's theory of society to found his possibilistic theory of history as progress. The moral or practical argument in favor of history as progress argues that the belief in moral values is strengthened by the discovery of advances and moral deeds in the past. The discovery of the potentialities of history helps to act morally in the present and the future. As Honneth shows, Kant was not fully convinced of these two lines of reasoning in favor of historical progress against the evidence of past errors and misdeeds. In his writings of the 90s, in the context of the faculties, particularly in Part 2, he introduced a more sophisticated and openly historicist argument in defense of the possibility of progress and freedom in history. Under the impact of the French Revolution and its unexpected violent course, he insists Enlightenment itself cannot do better than to reconstruct history from a viewpoint of moral universalism and political perfectibility against the impression of blind violence and the victory of irrational forces. He now proposes the idea of science in history, to translate the German word Geschichtszeichen, that had been developed by Benjamin. In light of and I'm citing here Kant, in light of circumstances and science prevalent at present, I propose that the human race shall attain this end, a constitution of natural right, and herewith also predict, even without the gift of the prophet's vision, a progression of the human race from then on toward the better that cannot be completely reversed. For such a phenomenon in human history will not be forgotten, since it has uncovered a predisposition and power in human nature, the likes of which no politician would have been able to cleverly deduce from the course of events to date. End of quote. And referring to the last effects of the ongoing French Revolution, he also wrote, quote again, "For that event is even too great, too bound up with the interest of humanity and too widespread in its influence throughout the world, that favorable conditions would not occasion peoples to remember it and make renewed attempts of this kind." Quote end. Kant's hermeneutic argument, shown here at length, is of relevance in today's controversies. He remembers us that historiography is a field of scholarship that cannot be taught without politics. He insists on the potentialities of progress hidden in past and present as a regulative idea behind all kinds of partisanship that historians may join in their writings and research activities. It is not success in the past, the normative power of facts, that should serve as the guiding rule, reconstructing the past, but the attempts of people to realize moral, political, or legal situations, conditions favorable for the realization of reason. Kant pleads in favor of a professional partisanship for the claims of enlightenment. He insists on the solidarity of scholarly reason with emancipative goals based on the use of reason. This historicist rationalism sets limits to any kind of political decisionism when political partisanship is in debate. For him, that meant, for example, that historical scholarship should play a critical role in refuting any defeatist, anti-revolutionary, conservative interpretation of the past in light of the violence of the French Revolution that served the interests of those in power. Historians have a kind of professional duty to reconstruct even those moves of emancipation that ended up in defeat or catastrophes, because they are part of a possible history of mankind in the making. Historiography can use its empirical findings and its realistic perspectives on the past to strengthen the cosmopolitan view that surpasses any particular success story of nations, social groups, or cultures on our planet. Historical reasoning with Kant keeps up the idea of collective learning of the species, but links it to the professional engagement with the realities of a past that is one of catastrophes as well as of progress in law, morality, and knowledge. For me, it is no wonder that this line of historical reasoning has been one of the outcomes of socialist thinking about the past when confronted with the untamed vitality of capitalism, the horrors of two world wars, of Nazi atrocities, genocides, and the disasters of communist revolution in the 20th century. Socialism or barbarism was a slogan already used by Kautsky, but normally attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, and later used after 1948 by the French group of leftist intellectuals and activists to keep in touch with the realities of a historical development that has put all optimistic objectivism on trial. Thank you very much.
Now we have a question and answer session. If anybody would like to ask a question. Susan? Ben? Oh, I know people.
Thank you, Lutz. I'm not sure if my question is a real objection to your position or not, because I like the position. I especially liked the points you were making towards the end about a regulative notion, which actually he takes directly from Rousseau's second discourse, the idea that, you know, your political views shape your conception of history, and et cetera, et cetera. So I like all that. We're also against all the same people. What worries me a little bit is actually a deep difference between Anglo and German readings of Kant. And if you want to, you know, say, well, hey, he was our guy, the truth is that within philosophy, it's actually long been thought that there's more Kant forschung going on in the Anglo world than not. And for Germans, I think it's extraordinarily hard to appreciate the fact that Kant says philosophy itself is not a science. Okay? You know, it may be, he would like to put Philosophy auf den sicheren Weg einer Wissenschaft, but it's not there. And towards the end of the first critique, he actually goes so far as to say no one should call themselves a philosopher because it would involve certain things about practical wisdom and goodness. And my own Doktorvater, John Rawls, never called himself a philosopher, citing that passage. So it's always very weird for me in Germany to have to say, ja, ich bin Philosopher. Okay? So, but you were talking about, you know, history becoming a Wissenschaft in that sense. And of course, I mean, David can chime in here. Usually history, although and not by constructivists, usually in the Anglo world, history is classed with the humanities. I mean, sometimes this. So I wonder if this very different reading makes a difference to your reading of Kant. Maybe not. And of course, you know, who am I to object to a historian saying, hey, back to Kant, we need more Kant?
Now, the difference I think, is pivotal when it comes to the way we, as historians, legitimate what we are doing. Interestingly, if you may call that what we are doing as a discipline, part of the humanities or part of the Geisteswissenschaften or part of Wissenschaften, the rules, you know, the protocols of practice are more or less the same. I wouldn't have any problem to enter a debate, you know, what we should better or maintain in peer reviewing, in going to the sources, what is source evidence. So that is, on a practical side, that is the same thing. When it comes to our look, normally historians are at the other end of the humanities when it comes in the debate with philosophy. They feel, as I would say, a little bit controlled and from above by philosophy, because they can't reason as abstractly as they do. So you normally you take care, you know. My thing is very simple. My argument, don't forget that, and then you start with that. That makes it always a debate that turns out to become rather complicated. When it comes really to theoretical debates in historiography, in history, let's say in American historiography about objectivity. Novick has written a marvelous book about that, you know. Then you see somebody among us took up the argument for the others, and all were happy that somebody is making a philosophically legitimate argument. But then often the majority forgets that there was an argument and what it was. So if you really look at what is the implicit reasoning, it is in the Anglosphere more or less, and a lot also among us Europeans, it's this empiricist thing, you know, it's a Hume argument, a Bacon argument, and it's good, it's sufficient, you know. You don't go in details about where comes this idea of tabula rasa from. Nobody would engage with that. Oh God, you know, I'm not a historian of ideas. So that makes it rather complicated, but it turned very different the last 30, 40 years. Because we have this approach in the humanities, and then it counts where the limits and the references are. We have a much more sophisticated blend of constructivism. The constructivist theory was idealism in the German and the European tradition, and besides some early remarks of Marx, the whole Marxist tradition didn't see that there's a point in common because they were materialists. That made it a rather complicated story, but to end up, the last 30 years, everybody who had a little bit of ambition and who was a little bit younger rushed to this kind of constructivism that seemed very to the point. That is Foucault. There's a power-knowledge nexus. We knew it. That is because our way of doing the things is not so complicated and not so sophisticated like the philosophers. So that is sufficient for us, and we take care. Power-knowledge nexus, as simple as that. And then you forget about all the other things. The problem is, and there I'm insisting, it's not, I got really also in complicated debates, because when you are pretending that it is better for all, and even my conviction is that we have a chance in Germany that this old-fashioned term of Wissenschaft is up there till now and must always be reactualized, you know, in our doing, because when it comes to humanities, you come to very, I would say, shortcut versions of the reflection on our doing. The reflection on our doing needs a reflection on the production, the ways our discipline is organized, the rules we really do. We look, what is the archive? It's not the Derrida derision of archive. The archive is a very complicated thing, and it needs protection today. Very funny story. Why we should engage in, you know, archival custody, not ourselves, but the discipline that is behind, you know, our neighbor discipline, and so forth. This kind of practical problems had found in me somebody who said yes to reflect on Kant, because that could be a way, and I'm very happy that reflecting on Kant now in the Anglosphere has become a sportive activity that finds some spectators. So that is a chance. Yeah. Because otherwise I would have to argue with Evans, Richard Evans I like, you know, but his empiricist arguments again, you know, the postmodernism is a little bit of clumsy.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Okay.
But the strategic aspect is, no, I insist on the general. There are so many communalities between all these different kinds of sciences we have today, that this old-fashioned science and humanities division is nonsensical. And even the philosophical descriptions of what is going on, and the reflection on what is going on, and the problems we have to maintain elementary rules of good scientific practice all over these disciplines needs to regard us as one folk, universalist. Not to say we learn from the natural sciences. Often it's just the other way around. Having sitting for 6 years, you know, in an advisory board for governments on federal and national level in Germany, together with other scientists, often they start, you know, the problem in the life sciences. Nowadays, they make their evaluations and nominations on the basis of calculated, you know, reputation. And the outcome is deficit, problems, fraud, all kind of negative things, and they regarded us as, I said, we do not yet do that. We read the text, or we can say to colleagues, please read the text. Don't only look at the top when it comes to a nomination committee. And that becomes only a point of defense when there is one general universal concept of this scholarship, from the biosciences to this small discipline in the humanities called historiography. That is, I think, is a point in common. And also when it comes to political interventionism, economic, incentives, a big problem, Or when we come to, yesterday you had it, what are the limits and what are the chances of diversity debates? All that needs to be taken into a political concept, and yeah, that's it. That is so behind it's not just a clumsy tentative to make fun to philosophers.
I wanted, yeah. So I wanted to come to the question of lies in history, because the extreme constructivist position says that we have positions, we have positionality, we approach the question of history through a perspective that is informed by affect and positionality. But if we come to a point where the difference between a positional and affective perspective and the attempt to tell a deliberate lie is erased, then do we have a discipline to come back to? Because, of course, with specialization, we have field and subfield which don't talk to each other. And I don't know if there's a philosophical underpinning to this, or whether it's a matter of a disciplinary consensus on it.
The problem of lie is also linked to the problem of error. I would say two very different things. We may make an error, and we correct us. And in the debates we saw that. Yeah, Cavell said, no, I didn't want to say this or that about where Locke's theory came from. He didn't take that one-to-one from this Arab scholar whose manuscript he could read. So that is, I would say, error as a misconception when you expressed yourself and the other heard it in another way. That's clear. The lie, that is really central. That would say, if there's a lie, that is exit of the profession.
But it doesn't happen.
It's a professional, that we need there a professional execution.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In a very simple way. You can't do that. And I say that it's important because we don't have, if you have in America, I'm ready to get the news, because as a president of our discipline for again 1 year, we are fighting about the way, the rules of conduct, for example, of our colleagues in the social media. Because there's often lie at the table in the texting. And that is not, about I made an error, excuse me. No. If you took this phrase there as it were in an article, an academic text, a professional text, we would say, correct that. That's wrong. And you know that, because you cite there in the sources and that it isn't there. And then you must say it. And somebody, you may repeat it. Youngsters it may happen to them. Professors? No. What is the way of this professional execution I demanded? Contempt. Not cited anymore. And if a university sees this colleague of us there, he's not usually touched by anybody. What to make of him? That we have remedies of self-defense, and I think fighting against lies is a necessity for self-defense. Otherwise, you have all those who are really doing bad trade inside your own lines, and you can't do it. Autonomy demands necessarily a professional discipline. It's old-fashioned, but I think we must insist on it. And it's complicated because the ways of our communication are changing. We had very strong rules for articles. We had very strong rules for peer reviewing things. That was more or less, since the last 20 years more or less, this changed. Because we couldn't control the amount of professionalized, specialized knowledge and information. So we must learn to really to make practical solutions to that. Otherwise, we can't maintain the standards. And that would be that lie, error, and truth claims couldn't be understood by the public. And that does never mean, I think, you know, adding an example, yeah, you are as an engaged journalist working that we need this professional ethics. Otherwise, you are losing your trade and you are losing confidence in your audience. Imagine that this is known by our students. Good luck.
It is now.
Yeah, perhaps, but then internal criticism is the other side of the criticism we have to do against those in power. If we don't link both sides, I can't see that we can stand what we are doing there, morally and also professionally speaking. And for example, when it comes to global history, it's very important to maintain standards.
Any more questions?
Eliza had a question.
No, then I have a question. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I have, in extension of the last question from Ben and what you just said, I come from a country where this discipline is on its way out. Okay, we don't have regulatory bodies. The regulatory bodies have been taken over. And that has a political dimension, of course. Okay, and one can expect that if the regime changes, it will come back to normalcy. But what we have seen over the last 10 years, that in between words like decolonial, post-colonial, postmodern, post-truth, countries which have regulatory bodies in the transatlantic world, in the Mediterranean world, they have actively supported the dissolution of this profession in countries like mine. And is there a way forward? Like, this is a very abstract question, but we are in front of philosophers, that how to kind of, like, for example, I'll give you a very practical example, that I'm not taking names, German institution has a tie-up with an Indian institution. And the Indian institution is not only involved in gross violations of any historical discipline protocol, but also the German institution decides to employ a person of Indian origin who goes to India regularly and now does the same thing. So this kind of practices are also part of what you are talking, just to an extreme. And what to do about this?
To fight it. Okay. To fight it with all the power one has. For example, in the German case, our funding body frees the relations to India. I was a member of the committee, you know that, and then we said we can't go on, you know, supporting these things because the other side is now nominated by government people who are ridiculously figures in historiography profession. Yes. So we freeze that, and the DFG was very, you know, reluctant to freeze because there are other sciences, engineering, very eager in going with it, and government is interested, Indian government, to have this reputation. And then we said in the committee, we gave advice, freeze that, and do it in the other way. Support, you know, via local, you know, assistance, those historians who are fighting for their autonomy and who are threatened, if that is possible. That was possible at that moment. That even may lead to some money that you spend there and there into hands that you would say that are corrupted. Perhaps. But that is, you know, I'm pleading for a realistic, diplomacy that must clearly draw a line, but never say that is. But that is a point we have to defend, and there's another way. We have this marvelous institution, of really collecting data on historians that are prosecuted. It's a colleague, Toon de Betz, in the Netherlands, who is collecting regularly on it's an engagement all over the world. He is producing his report, and it's our job, and you can look at the list, and that is one of also the things of solidarity, professional solidarity we have to see. That's the thing, and as body of professionals, American, Britain, and German historians can declare and must declare their solidarity when it comes to these inflictions and changements.
Can I come back on that for a minute? No, because I think one of the problems is, do we have a discipline that we recognize across the board as a discipline? Are we now in a position to say, for instance, if somebody says X is a persecuted historian, we have to all agree that person is a historian. And those criteria exist in some countries and they don't in other countries. Then we're faced with the other charge that, some institution in the white world is not allowed to decide what happens in the global south. So there's no such thing as a unified field of history. As an American colleague said to me once, that once you take history and you cut it into pieces, you have black studies, you have Jewish studies, you have Latin American studies, you have Latina studies, and you have Native American studies, and the residual thing called American history becomes white studies. And then, we are in a position to say, right, we are defending protocols, ways of doing things, rationality, particular forms of narrative, and we can argue here about a progressive versus an overly empiricist narrative. None of these terms make sense when history is, and I want to come back to Kaveh, the tension between one of the things you said and another, which is the interests of accurate history and balance and the interests of role models. Now, they can overlap, they should overlap, but there is a chance that a history is mobilized for the sake of national self-renewal or the mobilization of affect in certain groups, which may or may not be accurate history, and it needs to be both.
You want to?
No.
It's okay. Next question. Yeah.
Yes, I want to come back also Ben's question about the role of lies. In the conflict of the faculties, the notion of faculties that are distributed across disciplines are simultaneously mapping the making of mind. You kept referring to this idea of mind in the making beautifully, and that is literally the case, right? So faculties are both internal mental and external professional institutions. And in that situation, philosophy is going to operate as this mediating language across disciplines that are always interested around their own professional advancement, and philosophy is going to serve to mitigate that. But the final text within the conflict of the faculties is a text that is based entirely on dissembling. Mm-hmm. That is how the text is built. It makes its institutional contribution, its philosophical correction, in dialogue with the Faculty of Medicine, is precisely by virtue of introducing falsehood, misperception, miscommunication. So that troubling of the boundaries is, in fact, what is the corrective, not the appeal to facts. And I'm just wondering, what do we make of the standard of the factual in Wissenschaft when facts do not necessarily compel consent and don't necessarily travel across the faculties?
when you have really a contest about what is a fact from one discipline to another, then it becomes a very interesting object of research and of knowledge, I would say. And both sides have to, and both, no, when it comes to this situation, then what is a well-established fact for one discipline, and it is contested and not even a fact at all, but that would be more or less, that is a lie, you know, to make it all an error. Then it becomes very interesting because it opens the debate between the two disciplines, and it needs, you know, another effort to make exchange. I can't see that there's any other approach to that from a Kantian point of view. Because the limits the disciplines have are practical limits for knowledge production, nothing that is natural. So that is an open space. That is quite clear, I think. I wouldn't say, but that means, and that is not devoid of really practical consequences. We are in situations in the last 40 years where we have created a lot of new disciplines, often at the interchange between two disciplines. And then it comes, what is the professional standard of this new discipline? Is it lowering or the same? I can see that from history when they are inventing a new, you know, BA, MA, for whatever it is at stake. Let's take out the external pressure. No, the internal idiocies that comes up at that moment, because then you may create a new discipline at a low base. That was about speaking about global history. It's not that the good idea, the argument that is there, the philosophical idea of history in really weltbürgerliche Absicht. That is global history today. That is gold standard. I'm always preaching that, and people regarding me, because I'm not a global historian. I'm a very simple historian of Europe in the 20th century, nothing more. So, but that is clear that it is up to that. That doesn't mean that this discipline, if it is really to become not a fashion, but something to be really continued, as we see it's worth to continue that, then it must also be defined. And there are, for example, links to historical sociology. There are links to economy, otherwise you can't understand modernity in that sense you have developed, and so forth. And you must give the elements of professional, you know, knowledge to those entering this new field and debating with others what is, for example, the use of, as we call it nowadays, data mining or things like that. You know, we have a lot of plastic words nowadays, and nobody in my discipline can really define how to replace, you know, what we call sources, and then everybody more or less agrees what we all take in that big thing. When it comes now to data and data mining, and whatever you may invent, you know, in the space of digital humanities. So it's really about central things you are asking about. But I would say it's just a little bit more complicated, but for me, the scheme is not different. Naturally, the definition of the standards, the protocols of rule, have to be discussed very openly, and that is a chance, because self-reflection comes at the table. If you have a discipline that is full of routines, often it's habitus, it's not really ethics, and then it becomes more complicated.
Do you have a follow-up question? Because we have just 2 minutes to...
Oh, sorry, who was it?
Yeah, do you have a follow-up question? Because we have 2 minutes. It's okay.
So there must be more short.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you to really quickly, what does new discipline and the creation of new disciplines add to improving this work, this kind of standard of scholarly correctness?
What they can do?
Yeah.
No. For example, introduce new methods, saying you must learn this, you must know that, otherwise you can't really exercise in the field, as simple as that. And perhaps you must also reflect what kind, for example, language knowledge is necessary. Let's take the case, you know, when you really need serious scholarship in the field of global history of early modern period, to take the old term. You know, it's the three periods of modernity, global history approach of Yazdani. When that is the case, you must insist, for example, that the language qualifications must be taken up and popped up, because can you do it without reading in Persian? I was always shy of doing, you know, I would have liked it, because I'm inveterate comparative social historians, to compare the Kerala society, you know, of middle 20th century with the South Italian society of the same period. That would have been marvelous. But I can't speak and read Malayalam. End of quote. No chance as an historian. And that is good. It's fine. But that means you must a little bit, encore un effort, citoyen. Really. No, because I think the standard of language makes a difference to, for example, a sociologist who can do everything. It's not bad. Often he is doing many things on a theoretical level, but he waits for us to say, plausibly that was great, empirically zero. So there's an interplay.
We can take a 10 minutes break and then come back for the last session.